Hello and welcome to another 5-in-1 Mayaani Talks. I was just checking my microphone was on there. So far, over the last couple of videos, we have explored many topics which are largely an invitation to discuss these ideas and these topics in a more meaningful way, to hold meaningful and shared conversation about them. So, of course, we've discussed traditions and how they tend to be very fixed in certain cultures more than others, but across all cultures, there's a degree of traditions or a certain number of traditions which feel very fixed or can feel very fixed, with very little room for you to reinterpret them or make them your own. We've also spoken about identity and how our identity is fluid and constantly changing. I mean, literally from minute to minute, from hour to hour, day to day. Our identity is shifting and changing as we experience the world around us. Depending on how much you reflect on your experiences as well, your identity may shift quite significantly from moment to moment, from day to day. But it happens for all of us. Our identity is constantly shifting and changing. And therein was the question that I brought up in my previous video, about why it is we expect traditions then to stay fixed if identity is constantly evolving. Then surely traditions should naturally be allowed to evolve too. A majority of the traditions, if not all of the traditions which exist today, are after all not the original traditions to begin with. I think it would be very hard to say any tradition is the original tradition, because the tradition that is being celebrated today was simply an activity, for example, as most traditions are. It might be, in some cases, it might be cultural dress. It's something that we at some point in time decided was going to be the standard for us going forward. And then it was simply passed on to generations who were encouraged to not, not to change it, not to make it their own, but to simply follow it as it was passed down. Sometimes with very rigid and strict sets of rules to ensure it was, passed on exactly the same way. Which again, how much is it passed down exactly the same way? Because human error takes place. We know human error is a thing, and I would argue that it's already been evolving along the way. What we think is our tradition, that perhaps has been celebrated for hundreds of years, is not exactly the tradition as it was held hundreds of years ago, because inevitably it will have changed subtly along the way, simply through human error. If nothing else, it doesn't have to be an intentional desire to change it or reinterpret the tradition that will bring about the change. It's just a simple fact that time has passed, and along the way, people's, whether it's coming down to memory or how well it was recorded in written form, something along the way could result in the tradition subtly shifting and changing, and most likely has for most traditions that we keep alive and preserve today. So we explored how our identity evolves and whether or not our traditions should evolve in line with that. And further to that, I also looked into heirlooms with you and the expectation that tends to exist for a lot of us, I imagine, certainly in my experience, the expectation for us to keep heirlooms exactly the way they are. I would like to think there's more freedom in that now, that more individuals are receiving heirloom pieces with the freedom to make them their own, if that would be for them a beautiful way to deeply honor that heirloom. Because, as mentioned before, I personally feel whether you change an heirloom and reinterpret it to make it your own or keep it exactly the same is not the question, really. The important thing is the intention behind the action that's being taken. Whether or not you are undertaking the action of changing that heirloom piece, or keeping it the same way, out of a place of deep love and reverence and respect, and wanting to honor that piece and all the stories it carries and communicates and the legacy it holds for your family, or whether you are preserving it and keeping it exactly the same from a place of maybe fear, perhaps a worry about what people might think about you. This all stems down to fear, of course. But yes, within that fear, worrying about what people might think of you, worrying about not wanting to be the one who does change it or get rid of the heirloom, for example, or break, the passing down of this heirloom piece. Um, so, yes, we've discussed a lot of very, to some degree, for some people, very uh, triggering, perhaps, topics, because all of us may have some degree of experience with one of these things, either our identity being questioned when you seek to change yourself in a revolutionary way that suddenly leaves everyone around you who thought they knew you feeling like they don't know you. or whether it's in the sense of traditions. We've tried our best to connect with our tradition. We still feel very distant and alienated from it. We just want to have the freedom to make it our own, but we feel for some reason along the way, like we're not allowed to, not permitted to, feel like we need permission to, or whether we've experienced the heirloom situation where we've received an heirloom, or perhaps an heirloom has been in our family growing up, in our childhood home, and we've seen how that heirloom itself has been preserved, but not meaningfully. It doesn't seem as though it has a place in anyone's life or a real place in the home. Perhaps it's complained about a lot for taking up space. Um, so, yes, moving on from that now, I thought today we'd look at whether our desire to hold on to things in this way, because we do have a tendency to hold on to a lot of things as human beings. It's just a natural part of being a human being, I think, and something we're all hopefully working on as well, consciously. But whether we hold on to these things, hold on to our traditions, hold on to our identity, hold on to heirloom pieces in a very fixed and rigid way because of fear or out of truly wanting to honor those traditions, that heirloom piece, our identity. So let's look upon a couple of facts today, or more like, I'd like to think, points for thought. They're not really facts as such, but points for thought. So, point number one: culture has never been fixed. As mentioned already, what we see as traditions, or perhaps ancient traditions today, were once upon a time innovations. There was someone's bright, original, amazing idea that perhaps never existed before, or someone's reinterpretation of ideas that already existed. So it was someone's innovation. Ari bead embroidery was at once upon a time new. Moti Bharat evolved. Bridal traditions and bridal uh, attire in itself has evolved massively over different regions, over time, across across different cultures. Anyway, but within those cultures, it has evolved, and it still continues to subtly shift and change. Nowadays, we see subtle shifts and changes in bridal culture, whether that's in terms of the ceremony side of weddings, for example, what brides do in preparation for their marriage and leading up to their wedding, whether it's in terms of what brides wear. We see subtle shifts in this from year upon year. So culture has never been fixed and static. And traditions, similarly, those traditions which we protect today, I've got my notes here, you can see, those traditions which we protect today, essentially, they were at one point or another somebody else's reinterpretation of the traditions that already existed, or perhaps a completely new innovation because there were no traditions of that sort in existence at the time that these traditions came into being. Most likely, it's a reinterpretation because, as mentioned earlier in this video, it would be very difficult to say that any one particular tradition alive today, still celebrated and practiced and performed today, is the original tradition. I think it would be very hard um, to prove that, to be honest, and to be able to claim that. So nothing we nowadays defend as being authentic, in some ways, is actually truly authentic because at once upon a time it was completely new. Um, and what was authentic at that time was completely different. Another food for thought: control often masquerades as preservation. Very often, not always, but very often, when something is being preserved, it's being maintained according to a rigid stress set of rules. So traditions are heirloom pieces, and how we can incorporate them in lives, what we're allowed to do with them, our own identity. When it comes to preservation and a rigid set of rules existing around those things, typically that rigid set of rules exists because there is a fear of losing either status, losing identity, or losing authority. And I welcome you to share your thoughts on this. Sometimes that rigidity in thinking that we see surrounding traditions, surrounding heirloom pieces, that rigidity surrounding identity is actually more about control than it is about love and deeply honoring of what it is we're trying to preserve. Food for thought number three: identity has always been fluid. I mentioned this already earlier in the video. It's always been fluid, and there is strength in that. Identity was never meant to be fixed. We move continents, we move countries, we marry across cultures, we redefine ourselves along the way as we experience the world, as we discover different things about ourselves, and you interact with different communities of people who bring us different ideas, different perspectives, which encourage us to reflect upon our perspectives and ideas, and therefore encourage us to shift those perhaps in some cases or hold on more tightly. So our identity is constantly being redefined and constantly evolving as we ourselves grow as people. So therein comes the question, why would anything else in our world remain frozen? Anything from our hairstyle choices, our clothing choices, our food choices, all the way through to our luxury jewelry choices. Why would they remain static and frozen? And I mentioned luxury jewelry choices here specifically because, as we will touch upon in upcoming videos, our ideas when it comes to luxury jewelry have largely been fixed for quite a period of time. And they have not really been as allowed to evolve as we might think they have been. Food for thought number 4. Trust is the opposite of fear. When we actually place our trust in our traditions, in our identity, in the heirloom pieces, to actually survive being reinterpreted, survive being reimagined, survive being, um, in some cases, not necessarily survive being reinterpreted. I'm just looking at my notes here for a second. Yes, survive being reinterpreted or reimagined in some way. When we trust them to survive that, we're trusting in the strength of those traditions. We're trusting in the strength of those heirloom pieces. We're trusting in the strength of that identity. And of course, if that identity is strong, if that tradition is strong, if that heirloom piece is strong, it will survive that reinterpretation and that redefinition and that reimagination. If it does not survive the reinterpretation, reimagination, or um, re recreation, essentially, different, alteration in expression, then one would argue, or we could argue, that perhaps it was fragile to begin with, and therefore, essentially, was going to be something that was going to die out at some point anyway. Food for thought number 5. Conscious evolution is participation. When we are actually given the pass down the traditions, the identity, in some cases, because identity is passed down as well. When we are passed down the traditions, the identity, the heirlooms that we are passed down, we are entrusted to keep them alive. We're entrusted to keep, and part of keeping them alive is reimagining them, reinterpreting them, reworking them and reframing them. And essentially, through all that, then, once we've done all that, passing them on, continuing them. If we want people to actively participate in their traditions, in their history, in terms of heirloom pieces, for example, in their identity, if we want them to actively participate in those things, then there has to be freedom for those particular things to evolve, for us to not have a rigid set of rules and fixed mindset when it comes to how we approach the process of not only celebrating those things, the heirloom piece, the traditions, our identity, but also in terms of not having rigid rules in terms of how we decide to pass them on either. So essentially, when we allow our traditions, our identity, our heirloom pieces to evolve, we are participating in a very beautiful way in them, and essentially, through doing that, supporting their evolution. They're going to shift and change along the way, simply through us participating actively in those different areas. So I welcome your thoughts now on whether you think that a lot of the time we hold on to things, we try to preserve tradition, preserve heritage, preserve our identity, largely from a place of fear and from a place of losing control. And whether you think, in your personal experience, whether you've experienced that, the rigid set of rules that are expected, that you are expected to follow, um, first of all, but also whether you feel that should continue to be the case moving forward, whether you would rather pass on to the next generation traditions, identity, and heirlooms that they have permission to freely reinterpret, reimagine, rework, reframe, so that they can then consciously pass them on as living, breathing traditions, identity, and heirlooms rather than relics. So I welcome you to share your thoughts. Of course, if you enjoyed today's video, please do hit the like button. Feel free to subscribe and hit the notification bell if you wish to keep in touch with when my next video is out. If you've joined me this far, thank you very much for joining me. Remember, because your jewelry should always be more than just an afterthought, and I will be back again soon. Bye for now.